All right, everybody, welcome back to Introduction to U.S. Multicultural Literatures. This will be our final lecture on course content for the semester. This will be a lecture on the text of Valeria Luiselli's novel Faces in the Crowd. We had previously heard a kind of preamble to this lecture where we talked about different ideas about translation and world literature, and we also were reminded of the idea of the flaneur or the flâneuse. And these will be topics we'll revisit in the course of actually thinking now about the structure, the plot, the characters, and the text of the novel. So that will be today's topic. I want to begin today. We looked very briefly at Luiselli's biography. She's a fairly young author, young in author years. Different professions have different ages. How can I say? In different professions, they do young and old different ways. So, an athlete might be old if they're over 30 or something, but a writer is generally young if they're under 50. So Luiselli was born in 1983 in Mexico City, but to parents who were, I think her father was a diplomat, and so she grew up all over the place and eventually came to New York City to get a PhD. And she's lived, I think, ever since in the U.S. And she published her first novel, Faces in the Crowd, which we're reading about 10 years ago or 8 years ago, first published in Mexico and in the Spanish language. And then it was translated just shortly after in 2014 and published by a small press, actually a small locally based Minneapolis-based press called Coffee House Press. And then that brought her enough notoriety that her most recent novel, Lost Children Archive, was published by a major mainstream publisher and she wrote it in English because she's bilingual, or probably trilingual, having grown up in many different locations. So I want to just as a kind of pendant to her biography, which we discussed, I want to look at an excerpt from an interview she gave in which she explains at least one of her motives in writing Faces in the Crowd. So the interviewer asks, how did you write Faces in the Crowd? Did you write it in Mexico City or while you were doing your PhD? And she said, I actually started writing Faces in the Crowd here in New York when I just started studying at Columbia. I studied at Columbia for a year, then I left for 2 years, and then I came back. When I just started in Columbia, I was living in Morningside, so that's a neighborhood that features in the novel in New York City, and reading the English modernists of Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, so the English language modernist poets she says she was reading. At the same time, I was reading the Mexican modernists, so to speak, the group called Los Contemporaneos. They are the generational colleagues, although there wasn't ever really a dialogue between the Mexican contemporaneos and the English modernists such as Pound and Eliot. It was a one-way dialogue. It was more like the group in Mexico was translating all these people into Spanish, but not really vice versa. I started reading both at the same time while I was here studying my PhD and started making notes for a novel. It was a really bad novel at that point. So I think what I want to pick up on here is the idea of making what was a one-way dialogue a two-way dialogue. So when we talked about world literature as this almost utopian ideal that Goethe and Marx in the 19th century had posited of this kind of conversation among all the world's languages and literatures, that's a nice utopian idea. But in reality, as we also discussed, there are all these political and economic factors that tend to impinge upon that utopia, so that hierarchies of class, of race, of empire, of what nations are considered the dominant nations at the time, what languages are considered the dominant languages at the time, they get to set the pattern, the paradigm for what world literature is. So in a world where the United States is the most powerful nation, English necessarily is the most powerful language, that creates a world in which the writers of English language literature, they automatically kind of are considered important and get translated into other languages, whereas if you are living in a nation that's less powerful, writing in a language that, due to these prevailing inequalities and global hierarchies, has less currency, then those writers don't necessarily become as known in the world. So who gets to participate in world literature is not just a question of the merit of a given writer's work, but is a question of how that fits into these pre-existing national, international, racial, class-based linguistic hierarchies. So to bring that abstract concept back down to earth, Luiselli is saying that the English language modernists were being translated in Mexico into Spanish right away, when they, pretty much right at the time they were writing. Their contemporary writers, poets and novelists in Mexico, were reading those writers at the time, and yet Pound and Eliot were probably broadly incognizant of what their Mexican colleagues were doing, because Mexico was just not on their literary map, because it was considered this kind of almost at various times the United States had almost a kind of colonial attitude toward it, so might have been this condescension. So for them, world literature, they might have paid attention to what was going on in French or in German, or even to a certain extent in Spain, but not necessarily in Mexico or Latin America more broadly. And so in that way, it was a one-way conversation. And so, as we've discussed, a lot of multicultural literature takes the form of this kind of reparative discourse, this kind of discourse of reparation, of redress, that there had been these inequalities in the past, and the goal of contemporary writing is to in some way remediate them. And so Luiselli, 100 years later, takes up this goal of making that dialogue within modernism now a two-way dialogue. A Mexican writer, a Spanish language writer, will now speak back to those English language writers. So that's one of the things Faces in the Crowd is, and I think that's an interesting place to end the course, because we began with modernism, but there's a lot of unfinished business of modernism. And so neo-modernism isn't simply a repetition of modernism, it's a repetition with a difference. It's a repetition that adds new things to that discourse. So that's just how I want to begin with her introduction to the idea of initiating this new dialogue with modernism. So with that, I now want to get into actually looking at the themes of the text. So the slides will be organized by theme, and I will make remarks about the structure as we go. So the first thing to know, though, about the structure is that this is a novel that has two narrators. And you might think, it kind of almost, I would say, tricks you into thinking at the beginning that the two narrators represent two different levels of reality. Because we begin with a narrator who is really a person kind of like Valeria Luiselli. You're kind of invited to think about, this as an autobiographical novel. She's a young Mexican writer. She appears to be living in Mexico City with her husband, and then with two children, a baby girl and a boy who's like, are we given an age? He's like 5-ish, okay? So that's who she's living with, and she's describing herself as sort of stealing time away from her domestic, duties, because her husband works as an architect, so he goes to work and she has to stay home and raise these children. And she steals time away to write. And what she's mostly writing is a reminiscence of her time when she was younger, living in New York as a translator. And she's further describes that one of the notable things that happens to her is she discovers the Mexican poet Gilberto Owen. And she goes to, because he used to live in New York in Harlem. And so she goes to where he used to live, and she sort of steals this plant that she finds there that sort of strangely seems to be a plant he had described in his letters, because he had lived there in the 20s during the era of modernism and the Harlem Renaissance. And so she tries to convince her editor at this publishing house to let her publish a translation of Gilberto Owen, but she falsifies the translation as having been done by a modernist American poet she calls I can't even remember what she calls it, like Zvarecki or something. But the point is, the reason I can't even remember what she calls him is because he's a very thinly fictionalized version of a real American poet named Louis Zukofsky. And so I don't know why she puts in real, right? She puts in, Ezra Pound, Federico Garcia Lorca, Nella Larson, William Carlos Williams, but she doesn't put in Zukofsky under his own name. She puts him in under the name, whatever it is, Zvarecki. But anyway, she passes off her translation of Owen as Zvarecki's translation to convince her publisher to publish the work, because it's not just this Mexican poet that American readers won't have heard of. It's translations of this Mexican poet that American readers won't have heard of by an American poet they might have heard of, though actually nobody's heard of Louis Zukofsky either. I haven't even really read Louis Zukofsky, to be honest with you. But nevertheless, that's the idea. So there's sort of these two tracks to the narrative of her in the present in Mexico City, as a young mother. Let's say she's probably in like her 30s, and she's recounting this experience that seems to have happened about a decade before when she was in her 20s as a young translator trying to, make a go of it in New York City. However, then there is introduced this idea that she's also writing now as a, in Mexico City, she's writing a novel about Alberto Owen. And when Owen's voice begins to break through and much of the novel begins to be narrated by Owen, we are, I think, at first invited to think, well, we're just reading her novel. So there's this rock solid layer of reality, which is this young mother in Mexico City writing two things: a reminiscence of her earlier life while she was living in New York, and a novel from the point of view of Alberto Owen. Now, what's happening when he narrates? Well, he too is narrating retrospectively from a period of his life where he's older and he's living in Philadelphia in the 50s, and he's dying, and he's recounting his experiences when he was a young person in New York trying to make a go of it as a writer. So we have these parallel narratives, and they parallel each other in other ways too. So her marriage is breaking down, his marriage is breaking down. She has two kids, he has two kids. But it gradually starts to sound like he is writing a novel about this woman he keeps seeing in the subway that sounds a lot like our narrator, our first narrator, who doesn't have a name, but who seems like she might be Valeria Luiselli. And by the end of the book, it begins to sound as if he has written everything we read in the first part of the book. And you might think, well, how can that be? Because it's set in the 21st century. But we've already heard a number of characters, or at least one character in the book, talk about how important it is to remember the future. And then the final revelation of the novel is that both characters are dead. Both narrators are dead. That in Mexico City, there's been an earthquake, and the first narrator, the young mother, and her two children have died, and they are ghosts. And Gilberto Owen has died in his apartment, and he's a ghost. And the last thing that happens in the novel is these two these ghosts find each other, because there's been this motif of the little boy playing hide and seek with his father, and when he finds his father, he sort of slaps him and says, "Found." And midway through the novel, the father leaves to move to Philadelphia, which is where Owen went. And so Owen becomes the father, becomes in essence Valeria Luiselli's husband. So everybody in the novel is dead, and we've been reading this ghostly discourse, this ghostly colloquy between these dead narrators, neither of whom has any priority over the other. There is no solid level of reality in this novel. It's a solid layer of unreality, where everything is equally unreal. Everything is equally the discourse of ghosts. And so paradoxically everything is real, because if everything is unreal, well, I'll explain more about that later. It's a little bit hard to explain. I have to resort to mathematical concepts that I don't understand. But anyway, let's just let's just put that on pause. This is a very strange novel. I hope you read it. But let's just put that on pause and let's look at something that is real. So Gilberto Owen is real. Valeria Luiselli did not invent Gilberto Owen. He was a real person. He lived from 1906 to 1952. And he was a Mexican poet and diplomat who did spend time as a diplomat in New York City and Philadelphia, but while doing his diplomatic duties, he was also interested in literature and the arts, and hung out with all the poets and writers of the period, just as it's portrayed in the book. His works have not yet been translated into English, so he remains a figure that so what are you if you don't make it into world literature? You remain a figure sort of trapped in your national literature. So he remains, I think, I didn't look into it. Maybe he's been translated into French or Italian or something, but he hasn't really been translated into English. So Luiselli is operating from this correct premise. And there's a picture of him which she describes in the book. She says, Owen had a distant, gloomy, spiritual face like that of a religious martyr, high cheekbones, pointed chin, eyes disproportionately small, the body languid, dispirited, submissive, traces of Indian ancestry, and an aristocratic Criollo demeanor. So Criollo is a word from the way in which the hierarchy of kind of race and class works in Mexico. So Criollo suggests kind of aristocratic white. It's kind of a synonym in an American context for white, not only kind of racially, but as a connotation of the elite racial and ethnic and class group. So he combines disparate, divergent elements in his face. There's this Criollo aristocratic aspect, but there's traces of Indian ancestry, because Criollo, the kind of antonym of Criollo would be somebody who's mixed, mestizaje, I think. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right or saying that right. But so there's this kind of, in Mexico and in Latin America, there's a racial hierarchy as there is in the United States, though I think it's more finely graded, where in America it's more like white versus non-white, whereas I think in Latin America there's sort of finer gradations among the racial hierarchy, though it's still white supremacist. It's still based on a racist hierarchy that elevates whiteness, but there's kind of a gradation from white to non-white that doesn't quite exist in the same way in the United States. But in any case, the idea is that he's ambiguous, that he kind of combines these elements, and we're going to talk later about this novel's vision of sort of Latin American identity and how it fits in, especially in a North American context that is very black and white, and where that fits. So she goes on, none of the parts added up to a whole. I once read somewhere that personality is a continuous sequence of successful gestures. That's a quotation from The Great Gatsby, a novel you've probably read, Nick Carraway's description of Gatsby as this person who's kind of not what he pretends to be, but he's doing a very convincing imitation of what he pretends to be. And so Nick Carraway observes, the narrator of The Great Gatsby, that personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, which means that it's not real, that it's just this illusion. And she says, though, of Owen, that the opposite was true of the man who appeared in the portrait. The fissures and discontinuities were obvious. And I think that's a good description of this novel. This is a novel that's not trying to pose as a continuous, unbroken series of successful gestures. It continually interrupts itself, and interrupts itself as a corollary of real-world experiences of interruption that we'll see. So neither the novel nor its narrators, neither of its narrators, are trying to sort of convince you in this way that they're unbroken, that they're unfissured. It's a novel that allows for these discontinuities in experience. All right, so moving on, what else, what other themes does the novel address? What else is it about? So one of the issues it raises is one we've already discussed, which is the economics of literature and culture, especially the economics of world literature. So one of the things that happens in this book is when our first narrator is recounting her time in New York, she describes all of these eccentric friends that she had, these sort of comically eccentric people. And one of them is this guy called Moby. And Moby is a forger. So by profession, he's sort of a professional criminal, I guess. So he makes his money by forging books. He makes books that he passes off as first editions of important works of literature. And so that introduces into this book the question of authenticity. What is real? What is authentic? And that comes up in questions of who gets translated, because often who gets translated depends on if let me back up. So let's take it back to the American context. So American publishers, they have a certain amount of money set aside in the budget for stuff they'll translate from other countries. And often what they choose to translate is informed by certain sort of stereotypes they formed of the countries and cultures they're going to translate from. And so they will implicitly ask the writers they choose to translate to be representatives of the pre-existing stereotype of their culture. And one of the things they'll say is, well, we're looking for authenticity. This is something that publishers and literary agents often say. This is actually true. They often say we're looking for authenticity, whatever that means. And often what it means, paradoxically, is authentic to whatever stereotype they formed, which is to say inauthentic, or not inauthentic as compared to some standard, but inauthentic because there is no way for one writer or even 5 writers to speak for Mexico or whatever, Japan, China. That's not possible. There's not going to be an authentic voice of a multitudinous country, nation, culture, people, religion, race, whatever. And yet that is often what is asked of writers who are seen as being positioned as being representative spokespeople for their group. And so this idea of authenticity is one that the novel is consistently challenging. And the first narrator, I keep wanting to just sort of call her Valeria for convenience, but we shouldn't assume this book is that autobiographical, though I actually think it is to a certain extent. The first narrator becomes, in her turn, a forger. She forges those translations of Owen by Zvorecki. And because that's the only way to produce the kind of authentic document her publishers are seeking. So the novel is playing this very sophisticated game with this idea of authenticity, reality, unreality, what's real and what's not. And I think the reason it's playing that game is because it wants to disabuse us of the idea that authenticity should be a value in literature. That, in fact, you're never going to find that kind of authenticity, racial, ethnic, cultural authenticity. That's an illusion. You're never going to find that. And really, that value does more harm than good. She makes remarks, this first narrator makes remarks throughout the novel about just sort of making fun of the elite literary world in New York and how it's sort of seeking some kind of third world voice or something that no real writer is going to be able to live up to. And so that, I think, this character of Moby introduces that idea of forgery in this kind of comic key. And he also talks about how he has tailored his business, his sort of criminal enterprise, according to theories of specialization that derive from Adam Smith, who's the kind of first theorist of capitalism. And so literature in this book is kind of shown as being wholly subsumed by the logic of markets. And how does that work in the much more specific realm of the translation of Latin American writers? Well, there's this comic scene early in the novel where the editor, White, which I tend to think is probably a pointed name that he's given, the editor, White, says to her, "Weren't you a friend of Bolaño?" White shouted from his desk, etc., etc. "Haven't you got any letters from him or an interview or something we could publish?" he shouted. "No, White, I never met him." "Shame," says White. "Did you hear that, Mimi?" Minnie's the secretary's name, not Mimi. "Did you hear that, Minnie? We have the honor of working with the only Latin American woman who wasn't a friend of Bolaño." "Who's he, Chief?" asked Minnie, who never knew anything about anything. "He's the most popular dead Chilean writer ever. His name gets dropped more often than coins into a wishing well." So Bolaño is a real person, Roberto Bolaño. He was a Chilean writer who lived for a time in Mexico. He lived for some time in Spain, and he lived from, I want to say, 1953 to 2003, I want to say. And when he died, he wasn't that well known outside of Spanish language literature, though he was already hugely acclaimed in the world of Spanish language literature. But he began to be translated in the late 90s, early 2000s, and in the mid 2000s, he became huge. So posthumously after his death, he became huge. Everybody in the literary world was constantly talking about Bolaño as the greatest writer of our time, just without qualification, not the greatest Spanish language writer, but just the greatest writer of our time. And after his big masterpieces were published and then translated, they started publishing everything. I mean, we're down to there's still, this guy died, almost 20 years ago, and they're still publishing new stuff from him because they're just publishing everything they can find in his desk drawer or on his hard drive. They're down to the shopping lists at this point. So he became the figure of Latin American literature, of the Latin American writer, of what the Latin American writer was supposed to be. Just as kind of always happens in the matter of translation, because not all of that much gets translated into English. And so what does get translated from other languages and other cultures bears this extraordinary burden of representation. And so Bolaño became this big figure, and then what began to get translated were the works Bolaño approved of, the stuff he wrote essays on, the stuff he said influenced him, work by his friends. And she notes that this had happened in the prior generation too, with other writers from Spanish language literature. She mentions this poet Octavio Paz, and how everything he liked got translated. Now Bolaño hated Octavio Paz, and so this was a big changeover. But the point is that, it's a very kind of brutal economic calculus. Very little gets translated, then something gets translated, it becomes big, and then everything else from Latin American letters has to look like Bolaño. And in point of fact, this book actually is rather Bolaño-like. I mean, this is a first novel. First novels often don't wear their influences very lightly. And there's something very Bolaño-esque in a lot of ways about Faces in the Crowd. I can only assume Valeria Luiselli actually admires Bolaño and is not trying to run him down here. But what she is trying to criticize is the way in which translation, the economics of translation, the economics of literature and culture becomes totally subsumed in this kind of capitalist mentality of, well, what given limited resources can we sell? Well, what we can sell is what looks like what came before, even though that doesn't even make sense on its face. But the reason Bolaño became so big was because he was so different from the Latin American literature that had been translated before and was very trendy, which, by the way, was magical realism. And he very much took kind of a hard swing against magical realism. Even if when he did write about like ghosts and stuff like that, it was in a much grittier key. He was a very gritty writer. He didn't dwell on the marvelous. He dwelt on the dirtier side of life, let's say. I recommend, by the way, check out Bolaño. He wrote a couple of his books are really long, but he also wrote a lot of very acclaimed novellas, books that are all, around the same size as Faces in the Crowd. By Night in Chile is a good place to start. A very short novel called By Night in Chile. They're not for the faint of heart, though he never is. Anyway, I'm now rambling and digressing. Let's move on. So this theme of inequalities of literature and culture and how that impacts translation and world literature. So that's one theme this novel wants to address. This is also a novel about gender. This is also a novel about the particular struggles of female writers that male writers don't necessarily face, is how I would put it. And we've seen this theme before in the poets we've read. We've seen it in Muriel Rukeyser in particular, and in Adrienne Rich, I would say, who sort of foregrounded this theme of gender. It's been a theme foregrounded in some of the novels we've read, but not from the point of view of writing particularly. So we read novels that were about gendered experience, whether that would be Quicksand, or particularly female experience, which would be Quicksand and in certain ways Antelope Woman, but they didn't sort of talk about it in the realm of being a female writer. And we did read The Ghostwriter, which is very much a book about being a writer, and I would say it's very much a book about being a male writer. And so it talked about the gender of authorship, particularly from the perspective of a Jewish male writer who was foregrounding aspects of his sexuality in ways that he knew that readers would find offensive, particularly because he was trying to break down a certain anti-Semitic stereotype. But that, again, was from a very male point of view. So this is the first, I think, novel we've looked at that asks the question of what is different or what can be different in the experience of a female writer from that of a male writer. And one of the things, and she's, coming from also from a very particular experience, which is that not only of motherhood, but also of motherhood where the burden of the domestic duties fall upon the mother, and how that makes her work as a writer more difficult. So she says, novels need a sustained breath. That's what novelists want. No one knows exactly what it means, but they all say a sustained breath. I have a baby and a boy. They don't let me breathe. Everything I write has to be in short bursts. I'm short of breath. And so she talks about how partially the fragmentary form of this novel, because that's an aspect of the form we haven't yet discussed. This is a very fragmentary novel. Many pages are comprised of short little paragraphs divided by these asterisks. So it's almost, there are longer scenes, but most of the book is very fragmentary. And we are given this as a kind of explanation on the part of the writer. I could not write a sustained work of fiction in which, the scenes or chapters would be 10 or 20 pages long, because I have to care for these children. And that means that I don't have that much time to write. So I have to write when I can, and I have to write in these short bursts. And she also, goes on. She says, I go back to writing the novel whenever I'm not busy with the children. I know I need to generate a structure full of holes so that I can always find a place for myself on the page, inhabit it. I have to remember never to put in more than is necessary, never overlay, never furnish or adorn. Open doors, windows, raise walls, and demolish them. So, again, she attributes this experience of motherhood and its duties in a very unequal, kind of marital arrangement there, where to the fact that that's why the novel is the way it is. She also talks about the novel in terms that make us think of it as her own, as akin to her children, as something she's gestated. So she talks about the difficulty of her second pregnancy, that it was a very high-risk pregnancy. She was in danger of losing the baby. And she says, I prayed for the unformed baby, for the love of its father and brother, for my fear. Something in the silence convinced me that there was a heart in my belly, a heart with an aorta full of blood, a sponge, a beating organ. And she will later describe, I think I have this passage excerpted later in the slideshow, the novel as being a novel like a baby's heart. So that the experience of writing and the experience of gestation, of pregnancy, of giving birth are presented as similar. And that's, if Philip Roth had an almost, I don't want to say anything graphic, but if Philip Roth had almost a phallic theory of authorship that, one writes with one's phallus or something, she provides a counterpoint of writing that is not phallic, that is writing as pregnancy and labor, as opposed to writing as the other thing. So, and then there's one other aspect of gender here, which is that her husband's always reading over her shoulder and judging her and asking her questions and making comments. And they are often of a sexually censorious nature. That is to say, she's trying to write a reminiscence of her time, presumably before she met him, when she had other lovers and when she had male and female lovers, and when she, had certain sexual experiences. And he's always saying to her, well, how many men did you sleep with? Did you used to sleep with women? Or in this part I've mentioned, he says, that bit about masturbating with a photo is disgusting. He's always making these remarks. Now, she's trying to write a novel that tells the truth about her experience, and he's making these censorious remarks. And so perhaps we can assume that another aspect of the gendered experience of the writer Luiselli is attempting to flag here is the way in which male commentary, whether real or anticipated, might censor the female writer's disclosure, her candidness, her authenticity of her own experience. All right, so that's what I mean by, I'm talking about gender, the body, the experience of the female writer. Moving on from gender to issues of race, this novel often reflects on, I would say, the position of the Latin American writer within the racial context, not only of Latin American racial ideology, but of North American, Anglo-American racial ideology. So Owen, for instance, makes a lot of cutting remarks about criollos, about the kind of upper class white identified among Mexicans. And these remarks are, to the effect that they are, they're kind of arrogant. They're arrogant within Mexican society, and they are, from his point of view, trying to imitate a kind of white North American identity. So the problem with criollos, and even more so with criollas, because interestingly, given the slide we just had, Owen seems in a lot of ways to hate women, which Luiselli sort of unflinchingly presents but sort of leaves unremarked. So that's something we might want to think about. But is that they're convinced they deserve a better life than the one they have. So there's this sense of entitlement. And then he sort of turns his gaze in the American context, because Owen's trying to sort of figure out when he's in the United States where he fits in. Does he identify more? And he speaks in this very crude racial typology, which I don't know. I don't know how much she's directly quoting his letters and how much she's making up, but I assume he speaks in a way that's accurate to somebody who lived 100 years ago would have thought about these issues. So it's not how we would speak about them, but it's accurate to how he would have thought of them. And so he often speaks of the United States as divided between what he often calls Swedes and Africans. Like, that's the only two ethnicities that are in the United States. And he's trying to figure out, well, where does he fit in as someone from Mexico who appears to be in a lot of ways white, sort of white passing, but probably has some indigenous heritage. And, it makes me think, too, of the line in Marilyn Chin's poem about Asian American identity, about, she says, not being neither white nor black. So where does he fit in this American racial hierarchy? So He doesn't like criollos, but he says the blacks are transparent. At night they dress in glass. I don't know what that means. I have sometimes walked through Harlem among a river of voices, without a course, without a spring cry that no one uttered. Through them all night is visible, transparent. They talk like your Yucatan people. So he kind of, at this moment, seems to be identifying with African Americans, and to sort of see his role as identified with African Americans. But this will be, I think, a constant motif of the novel, and it's sort of picked up later. I want to skip down to my last passage, in the figure of Nella Larson. So Nella Larson appears as a character in this novel, and Owen describes her. Nella Larson was a writer. She was also Danish and a mulatta. In that sense, she was a walking, wiggling paradox who united the two characteristics that separated the Owens from the Federicos of this world, the Swede and the African, the world of the whites and the world of the blacks, what was not mine and what was not his. So he describes himself as more white identified, and Federico Garcia Lorca as more black identified. But he sees Nella Larson as this figure who's able to truly unite in her person in a way he can't these kind of different identities. But this question of the paradox of this identity, where the Latin American writer, where the Latin American person fits in, particularly in the United States setting, is a theme of the novel. I'm going to actually skip these other passages because I don't want to take too long. Well, I won't, actually. So one thing that the first narrator, Valeria, for convenience, says is she's going to some event where they're going to sort of talk about the translation of Latin American writers. And she's pretty critical, I would say, of identity politics in this novel, because I think she sees it as this way of what we already talked about before, sort of constructing these images of authentic identity for the benefit of a largely white readership and for the purpose of sort of creating a marketable image. So she says these events, which are supposed to be, for the benefit of Latin American writers, are really just a modern day version of Latin American civilized barbarity, which was this sort of trope that defined Latin American writers. A version of it existed for U.S. writers as well, in vis-a-vis Europe. But the idea was that in the New World, citizens of the New World, whether that be North or South America, but in this particular context, she's talking about the Latin American idea, they don't have the long traditions of Europe. So they're sort of half barbarian and half civilized is the basic idea here. So this is, again, a very old trope that we wouldn't want to reproduce today, but she says we are actually reproducing it. This kind of identity politics is just taking some of these old tropes and putting a kind of politically correct spin on them, but under them, that's all there is. There's actually no true equality. Everything is still caught up in these hierarchies. They've just been rebranded in this liberal seeming way to make people feel good about them, but actually it's just the old stuff happening. And what is, I think, Owen's critique of the Yanks, so those sort of white Americans, that he makes is interesting. He says the moral problem with Yanks is that they think they are Swedes, yet in certain circumstances they're just as bad-mannered as Mexicans, but more calculating and hypocritical. So in other words, this idea of civilized barbarity applies as much in North America as in Latin America. It applies as much in Anglo-America, that the new, everybody in the New World sort of shares this sort of destiny of not being connected in these ways to the long and polished traditions and hierarchies of Europe. But what whiteness is in the New World is the denial of this, the belief that you're somehow better, the belief that this unearned entitlement that he attributes to the criollos. So that's, these are not problems the novel ever solves for itself. I think they're more just conflicts and contradictions it raises. But I think it's worth paying attention to that. All right, we already sort of got into the idea of forgery, authenticity, and originality, and what that has to do with literature. So my first excerpt here, it actually is related to what we were just talking about, where she talks about the reception of the translations of Owen by Zvorsky that eventually get published. She says, first on obscure internet sites specializing in third world authors, translations, and minority writers in general, ethnic, racial, sexual, etc. And I think in the etc., you hear a little bit of contempt there, a little bit of skepticism here that goes back to what we were talking about a couple lectures ago of critiques of multiculturalism and identity politics from the left. That what appears to be a laudable interest in writers who come from outside the normative dominant culture just becomes the new sort of marginality. It becomes a form of marginalization or ghettoization that you can congratulate yourself for participating in, but it's just this kind of condescending positioning of these writers, and maybe from this point of view, maybe this very class could fall under that critique, because it's not necessarily something any one person, any one writer, any one teacher, any one critic could escape from. It's the kind of prevailing condition. But I think she raises this interesting critique, and then she talks about, in this paragraph, articles appeared in academic journals attesting to the authenticity of the manuscript containing translations by the poet Zvorsky of the great Mexican poet Gilberto Owen. And we know that there is no such authenticity. So she's making fun of academia here, that academia just finds what it set out to look for. But this idea of authenticity is an illusion. So why though? Well, why do people want this illusion of authenticity? Well, because it allows you to create these kinds of hierarchies of taste. You get to be the first person that discovered Gilberto Owen. You get to be the first person that discovered Zvorsky's, or what does she call them? Zvorsky's translations of Gilberto Owen. And so if you have authenticity, it creates a genuine standard for the hierarchies that already exist in the arts. And I think this is a theme that replicates itself at kind of all levels of the novel. I think one of the moments is that I think is amusing is where her husband talks about how he was one of the first people in the entire Spanish-speaking world to discover the band Joy Division, though the joke is that he can't remember the name of the lead singer, which is usually when I teach this class in person, I put that out as a trivia question. And one person, it's always just one person, but one person always gets it. Joy Division was a British post-punk band from the 80s. Lead singer Ian Curtis, just FYI. But the joke here is that the husband is claiming to be, the first person in the Spanish-speaking world to discover the band, but he can't remember the name of the singer. But the point is, there's always something to be gained if you can claim to have some privileged relation to some valuable cultural object. There's these sort of laws of power and economics that exist in the world outside of the arts that exist just as much in the realm of the arts. No matter how much you tell yourself it's about beauty, it's about authenticity, it's about genius, or in the updated version, it's about honoring marginalized voices, things like that. No matter what alibi the arts give, Valeria Luiselli is telling us, for what they do, they're totally caught up in these hierarchies of value that are based on flawed concepts of authenticity and sort of getting there first and being the first to do something or the first to know something. It's totally caught up in these ideas. And so so she really, I think the concluding remark in the novel here is, that's the way literary recognition works, at least to a certain degree. It's all a matter of rumor, a rumor that multiplies like a virus until it becomes a collective affinity. So it's all this kind of imperfectly understood stuff that begins to circulate around the name of an author until it reaches a critical mass and that author becomes famous and heralded. And how that process happens is mysterious. It's often, very often, more often than not, corrupt. And yet that's all it is. So, and that's, the punchline here is, when White asks her to see the manuscript of Zworsky's translation of Owen, he asked to see the original manuscript, which we both knew didn't exist. There is no originality. So this, though, invites the question, is the novel going to leave us in a completely cynical place about art and literature? Is it not? Is it just, well, we already met my fellow Pittsburgher, Andy Warhol, in this course. A famous line that he said was, art is what you can get away with. Is that what the novel's going to leave us with? And, my guess is going to be no, because that's too bleak a message. Why not just, once you've heard that, why not just throw the book in the garbage and go on with something else? So I think the novel is going to have to find something else for literature and art to be and do, since it can't produce authenticity, since it can't pretend to be the authentic voice of the Mexican writer. It has to find something else for itself to do. So what is that going to be? Well, this slide is not a direct answer to that question, but let's leave that question. What is art and literature for in this novel if it can't be for authenticity? So one of the things this book does tell us about, and in this way I think it returns us to where we began the course with Pound in poetry and Larson in fiction, is that the novel, if it can't necessarily be the authentic voice of a race or culture, it can be the more or less authentic articulation of other kinds of experience. And we saw that already with gendered bodily experience. It can be the authentic voice, at least, of one experience of motherhood. I think the other thing it can be the authentic articulation of is of modern experience. And so modernism is often said to have been, I think we said it ourselves, and I think that its practitioners were well aware of this, one of the things that made modernism new and made it modern was it was a body of literature that was recording new kinds of experience, because the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century, experienced a massive, really almost unprecedented technological change. And that went along too with urbanization. So more and more people find themselves living in cities and experiencing in cities genuine novelty, genuine marvels, genuine technological things that had not been experienced before, such as subways, electrified trains, underground electrified trains, telephones, radio, x-rays, all of these things, recordings, the record player, all of these things are new. And modernism is often understood as being the literary expression of this newness, particularly focused on the city. Similarly, the figure of the flaneur or the flâneuse, wandering the city and seeing its kind of consumerist spectacle brought about by these new technological changes. So this novel returns us to that moment. It particularly in the passages by Owen, the moment in which the novel was genuinely novel by producing and recording the sensations of the modern city. So Owen says things like New York has to be seen from the viewpoint of the subway. And then he says the subway, its multiple stops, its breakdowns, its sudden accelerations, its dark zones could function as the space-time scheme for a novel. And if our first narrator, Valeria, for convenience, Valeria, if she gives us an explanation for this novel's fragmentary form that comes from her experience of motherhood, it has to stop and start because she always has to stop and start to look after the kids. Owen gives us an explanation because he writes in the same style. He gives us a different explanation, a technological explanation. He writes in that style because he's trying to find a literary form adequate to these new urban sensations. So he writes a novel though in a way that the subway moves. The subway stops and starts, and you get off and you get on. And so the fragmentary form of his novel approximates that. So I think that's interesting. I also think by raising this issue, Valeria Luiselli is inviting us to wonder what contemporary technological forms her fragmentary structure approximates. Because you remember when we read The Martyred, I suggested that much mid 20th century fiction reads like a movie. And I said that The Martyred had read very much like a screenplay. Every chapter began with a description of, what room are you in? And then once you get that description, the characters start talking and dialogue takes over. And I said you could clearly see in The Martyred and in much other fiction of that period the influence of cinema. And I think I might argue that because Valeria Luiselli is not the only person writing fragmentary fiction like this nowadays, I would argue that we're beginning to see the impact of social media, that this very fragmentary structure of starting and stopping, rapid shifts in tone, very brief sections, this feels to me very much like a feed, like a Twitter feed or Facebook feed or whatever, substitute anything more updated you want. It feels, almost, tweeted or something like that. So in recalling the way in which the modernist novel tried to find formal corollaries to new modern experiences, I would say maybe this neo-modernist novel is also trying to find formal corollaries of our contemporary technological experience. And I think one of the things that's fun about this book is it recreates the kind of glamour of that idea. When Owen says, I liked the idea of being a despairing poet in New York. I think one of the things postmodernism did was, in exposing all poses as poses, in destroying the idea of authenticity, which, Valeria Luiselli takes up, there was also, and we discussed this, a sense of sort of cynicism that accompanied that. And I think one of the things that neo-modernism often does is it just sort of accepts as a matter of course the critique of authenticity. We can't go back to a full sense that any representation is fully true. But what we can, maybe, now that we've gotten used to the idea, we can go back to seeing certain representations and certain poses and certain positions as having a genuine glamour. I liked the idea of being a despairing poet in New York. It's, there's a certain fun to, I grew up in the suburbs and then I went to college in the city. And so, I was always, I think my influences were more like, at the time might have been more like Batman comics or something. But like there's a certain glamour to walking around, the city in the rain and a long coat and thinking, I walk these dirty streets. And what you're saying in your head is kind of depressing, but actually you're enjoying this posture. Maybe I've just confessed too much about myself and maybe you think this is nonsense. But my point is, I don't even know what my point is. My point is, the idea of being a despairing poet in New York is fun. And this book, at least if you're a certain kind of person, and this book recreates that glamour and is, I think, fun to read and was very successful for that reason. This was a book that put the author on the map, and she was able to go on to much more success in the literary world. And not least, I think, is financial success. And I think because she recreates this glamour, this modernist glamour for a new period, is one of the reasons. All right, moving on. This book is also very funny on the topic of translation. This is a book in which the idea of adaptation rather than translation is emphasized, and so we get these very funny passages where Zvorsky is writing poetry in English, and so Zvorsky, who, remember, is the real poet Zhukovsky, he and Lorca and Owen plot this thing they're going to do where they're going to perform. And they're going to perform, and Zvorsky's going to, so Lorca's going to translate Zvorsky into Spanish, and then Owen's going to translate it back into English. And what they produce is just this ridiculous nonsense. And Zhukovsky's poetry, by the way, is very difficult. So I don't know that it's nonsense, but it's not poetry that always makes completely immediate sense. So they're going between languages in this way that's just humorously nonsensical, in this kitchen insane Hoover us this itching is saying behoover us, you know, and it just goes on like that. And so I think one of the things that perhaps the novel is trying to communicate to us is that just as the idea of authenticity is not really admissible, at least, you know, in terms of culture, you might find authenticity to certain sensory experiences or certain personal experiences. Being a mother riding the subway, the book might be authentic to those experiences, but it can't be authentic to cultural experience. And so in that case, don't worry so much about a faithful, quote unquote, authentic translation. Just have fun with translation. Just be playful. The purpose of literary language, of poetic language, of artistic language is to be ludic, to be playful. Just as this is a modernist value too, and I think the writer we saw that most exemplified this was Gertrude Stein, who would do, you know, she often said, I just want to let words do what they want to do. And one purpose of at least literary language is to do that. Let words do what they want to do. Don't constrain everything so severely. This is also a book about ghosts, not only in the literal sense that the characters are ghosts, but also in the sense that I think it's about ghostliness in a more metaphorical sense. So, there's a passage where the first narrator says, I can't invent, I only manage to emulate my ghosts, write the way they used to speak, not make noise, narrate our phantasmagoria. And she also says later that the ghost is me, which proves to literally be true at the level of the narrative, but it's also true in the sense that one of the things this book is about what literary theorists have discussed as belatedness. The sense that as a writer, everything great has already been written. So you're setting out as a young writer and you're reading Hilberto Owen, and you're reading Ezra Pound, and you're reading Nella Larson, and you're reading Gertrude Stein, and you're thinking, boy, I'm never going to be that good. And boy, they really captured everything there was to capture about what they wrote about. And so what's even the point? And so you feel belated. You feel that you've come too late into your inheritance as a writer. And so you feel like there's a paradox here, which is they're dead. They're literally dead writers. But they wrote these works that are still so vibrant that they are more alive than you are. Their books are more alive than a book you could write. So now, again, this is a concept that's been discussed a lot among literary theorists. They talk about how when you start out as a writer, you have to confront this question: what are you going to add? What is it that you bring? You know, it almost is like an accusation. You know, you're going to stand beside Gertrude Stein and Nella Larson and Ezra Pound. What do you have to add that's new? So every young writer has to confront this. And there's even a more updated term for this called hauntology, which is a mashup of the term ontology, ontolgy, which is the term for the philosophical study of being, with haunting. So it's like being a ghost, being haunted. And it's been theorized as a nostalgia for lost futures, that the future seemed somehow more possible in the past, but we're just condemned to repeat the past rather than moving forward into a new future. So that, I think, is what all the ghost talk in this book is about. It's about the dilemma of the writer who's coming into the world of literature and has to face the question of what she can add to what's gone before. And so in that way, and her solution is that she kind of repeats modernism with the differences she brings to it. So, you know, so modernism becomes this thing that haunts the present. Just as she is haunting the modernist past. She and Owen are keep seeing each other in the subway because they're both ghosts. He's literally dead. She's sort of figuratively dead as a writer. But that's what all the ghost talk is about. And this comes out too, in that they both see Ezra Pound. They're both haunted by the figure of Ezra Pound in the subway. So, moving on though. Another literary theme we already mentioned, so I'm just going to touch on it lightly, is what I call bridging American literatures. So she's constantly referencing in her novel, published in Mexico, written in Spanish, she's constantly referencing U.S. writers. So she references Saul Bellow, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, Emily Dickinson, Langston Hughes, Nella Larson, Emily Dickinson, I already mentioned. She also mentions Lorca, who's a Spanish poet who spent a lot of time in New York and was very influential in Latin American letters. And the idea here, I think, is again to create a two-way conversation where the U.S. writers who had more prestige because America was a very powerful country and English a very powerful language are brought into conversation with Spanish language and Latin American literature. But the sort of the high point here, the coup de grace or whatever you want to call it, I think that's the high point. I think it's the killing stroke, but never mind. The high point where this book really does this is in the passage where Owen starts talking about the novel he wants to write. I know I want it to be a novel set both in Mexico, in an old house in the capital, and in the New York of my youth, which is the novel we're reading in certain ways. All the characters are dead, but they don't know it. That's the novel we're reading in certain ways. Salvador told me that there's a young writer in Mexico doing something similar. The bastard went and stole my great idea. And what you have to know then is that this book is a kind of takeoff on an earlier Mexican novel. And not just an earlier Mexican novel, but the novel that's often said to be the great Mexican novel, and one that most Mexican readers are familiar with because it's studied in school. I think the same way in which if you go to high school in America, you will read The Great Gatsby. And this is like the great American novel, or at least the shortest great American novel, so the most fit for the high school classroom. So this novel, Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo, published in 1955, is, I think, has that stature in Mexico. So, most Mexican students will have read it in high school and be familiar with it in that way. And so Luiselli, in basing her novel on Pedro Paramo, which is a novel, I'm kind of running out of time here, so I don't want to spend too much time explaining this. But the basic idea is, this is not a spoiler because you learn this halfway through. This book is very short, by the way. This is 100 pages long. And I highly recommend it. It's an excellent novel, Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo. And it's very short and very brilliant. But all the characters are dead. And all the characters are ghosts, including the narrator and all the people the narrator is speaking to. And they're reflecting on the life of this man, Pedro Paramo, who lived this much more vital and intense life than they're leading. So similar to the book we're reading, it's about this idea of belatedness, of feeling like a ghost because it seems like everything interesting has already happened. Though in this case, it's also everything sort of brutal and awful. I have a little plot summary here. Also, the narrator is named Juan Preciado, and we meet this character Dolores Preciado in Faces in the Crowd. So Faces in the Crowd is full of allusions to Pedro Paramo. So the idea is Luiselli is writing a novel that is the synthesis of Mexican literature with U.S. literature. That is the synthesis of North and South American, or at least North and Central American literature. She's writing a novel that will bridge that gap, that will be both. That will be exactly what I've presented it as. It is a Mexican novel. It is an American novel. I think it has to be regarded as both. And so it's a Mexican novel that is in a class on U.S. literature because of this bridging. And I think her sort of highest gesture in this regard is to write this novel so much about the United States and U.S. literature, but have its basic structure be based on a great Mexican forerunner. And again, Pedro Paramo, short book, like 100 pages long, brilliant, amazing, I recommend it. And finally, I think this is a book that is most faithful to modernism in most trying to, as Ezra Pound said, make it new. to do new things with the form of fiction, to be experimental, to not just take for granted. I mean, think of all the things this novel doesn't take for granted. It's fragmentary, so it doesn't take for granted that the novel should be written in continuous prose. It's has multiple narrators, has two narrators. It has multiple time frames. It has multiple planes of reality. Owen and Valeria, to call her, is neither of those characters is more real than the other. So it's all sort of existing on this same unreal but real plane. And it constantly sort of has these meta reflections upon itself. So there's a moment where there's a character briefly introduced, a dancer, and he's very sure of himself. And Owen reflects on him. He says, there are people who are capable of recounting their lives as a sequence of events that lead to a destiny. If you give them a pen, they write you a horribly boring novel in which each line is there for an ultimate reason. Everything links up. There are no loose ends. And that's the novel this novel is not trying to be. It doesn't want to be linear. It doesn't want to all go in one direction. It doesn't all want to make perfect sense. It's saying, let's be experimental. Let's dance. Let's paint. Let's have the freedom of other forms of modern art that aren't expected to be shackled to the sensible. And so what is it? It's a dense, porous novel like a baby's heart. It's not a fragmented novel. It's a horizontal novel narrated vertically. It's a horizontal novel told vertically, a novel that has to be told from the outside in order to be read from within. Her husband asks how much is fiction and how much fact. It doesn't matter. Don't ask. It's not important. The importance is that it's an experience. And if it's authentic to certain other kinds of experiences, like that of maternity, like that of the modern city, but not to some perfectly linear logical argument or some hierarchical idea of what a culture is. It's only a novel. None of it exists. And I think that brings me to my final reflection, which I only half understand, which is the novel as a Mobius strip. So a Mobius strip is a figure in geometry, in topography or topology or whatever the hell it's called, it's a strip. You can make one. You take a piece of paper, you cut a strip of paper, you twist it once, and then you join the ends. And then when you trace your finger around it, your finger travels for a while on the outside of the circle you formed. But then when you come to the twist, your finger goes inside and now begins to trace the inside of the circle you formed. So the point of the Mobius strip is that you can never tell truly which side is the inside and the outside. Just as in this novel, you can never tell which narrator is more real, which time frame is more real, or which setting is more real. It's all equally real, so you're always truly on the outside of this experience, and it's all equally unreal, so you're always truly on the inside of this experience. Just as in the Mobius strip you can't tell inside from outside, in this novel you can't tell real from unreal. It's all real, it's all unreal, it's all outside, it's all inside, and it's folded in on itself to show that time isn't linear. If you dedicate your life to writing novels, you're dedicating yourself to folding time. So time becomes not linear, but it becomes something you can recapture. And I think so much of what we've read in this course has implicitly agreed with this, that writing literature and reading literature is about the recapture of lost experience, about the recording of experience, about folding time back in on itself so you can recover experiences that would otherwise be lost. And that's the thing the novel does if it can't present you with authenticity to culture. So we remember Valeria Luiselli dismisses that you can't, whatever alibi art gives for itself, it's so caught up in hierarchies of power that it can't really do certain kinds of moral and political work that people are asking it to do because it's too compromised by inequalities of power. What it can do is provide new kinds of sensation, new kinds of experience, and can recapture lost time. And I think that's in a way, even though this novel has sort of dismissed the moral element that I think we often so deeply want to be true of art, that it will be somehow morally or politically redemptive. And so many of the authors we read in this course believe that very strongly, and I don't think it's something we want to slight easily or casually. But insofar as this novel does slight that element, it presents instead a kind of different utopia of literature as this realm of play, of freedom, where nothing is truly lost. And I think that has its own nobility. And so I'm very comfortable ending the literature we're reading in this course with that. So thanks very much for your attention, and have a great day.